Hi, hello, hi. I am your host, Steven, aka Mount Analogue. Welcome to Analog Thoughts. If this is your first time, welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. If this isn't your first time, welcome back. Welcome back. I promise we're going to get right into today's topic, but I like to do just a little bit of rambling for a few minutes, just a few minutes at the start of these episodes. So hang tight while I brain puke for just a moment. One of the things I like to do at the beginning of these episodes is give a brief life update. If you've listened to the last few episodes, you're probably tired of hearing me say this, but I've just been writing. I've been trying to stick to 1K words a day. And I've been really, really, really enjoying the process. I'm learning a lot from a podcast that I'm listening to called The Essentials of Writing a Novel. It's all by this guy named Jim Thayer. And if you're interested in fiction, if you're interested in just writing in general, I cannot recommend it enough. It's got a really easy to remember title, The Essentials of Writing a Novel. And I won't completely bore you with the process of writing because that's not exactly why you're here. But I'm getting deep into the nuts and bolts of this plot and how everything is unfolding. And I'll be, this year I'll be doing some crowdfunding this spring to get the ball rolling on working with an editor after the first draft is done and ready to edit. And then I'll also be doing some crowdfunding for the artwork, which I already have an artist in mind to make the artwork. I'm really excited about that. These characters in the book are showing me things that I did not anticipate, and I am really excited to explore how they handle some of these situations I'm planning on putting them in, and I'm stoked to see how things develop. Stephen King said it best in his book on writing. When you write a novel, it's like you are unearthing a story. You push the dirt and the dust back and see how it all fits together. And I honestly really love that part of it, the part where you build a backbone of a story and then let the characters exist within the story. And in a really weird way that I can't fully explain because I'm not really a writer, stories kind of write themselves. And sure, you come up with the ideas and plot points, and once you're in that flow state, things just start happening that are kind of out of your control. You come up with ideas and plot points and the backbone, but once it gets going, things start happening that you cannot anticipate, you will not anticipate, and you just have to roll with it because no one can outline a story completely. Like if you outlined a story completely, it would be as long as your first draft. So there is this inevitable time for improvisation and exploration into things that you don't anticipate. And honestly, that's kind of what I like the most right now about writing. It's like that with music, it's like that with drawing, with all types of art, at least it is for me. You do some like preliminary calculations and sketching and then something starts to materialize in between the sketch, or like once you have the sketch. It's honestly about giving yourself parameters, a palette to work with. For me with this novel, I built the three main characters and I gave them a primary villain they need to face, and I gave them a way to face the villain. But beyond that, they are just doing their own thing. I told myself it needed to be that my novel needed to be a light-hearted horror, or just like cozy horror, if you want to call it that. Not necessarily terror or tragedy, but that's kind of the I gave myself parameters. I guess what I'm trying to say here is give yourself parameters and let your creation exist within those parameters, but don't try to define it too much. Don't try to pin it too much because you can lose some of that raw essence and some of that beautiful improvisation that can arise. It goes with music, it goes with painting, it goes with sculpting, it goes with cinema, screenplays, plays, whatever your thing is. Don't try to nail it down too much because you'll lose some of that essence that made it beautiful in the first place. I actually read this thing about Steven Spielberg's E.T., the movie, and when they got started with everything, the only real notes that they made pertaining to specifically the ending is that there's a bicycle chase and E.T. and Elliot escape. That's all they wrote. They knew they knew there was going to be more to it than that, but that's all they wrote in the notes for the movie. And eventually that got storyboarded scene by scene and they filmed what they filmed. But before that, it was just this raw idea, this raw sketch of like a boy and his alien run from the government. And yeah, keep creating. Don't stop. Never stop. Never gonna stop, yeah, never gonna stop. Okay, I promise. We're going to get into today's topic very soon. Just a little more rambling from me, just a tiny bit more rambling. I've been doing an update on my son, Felix, at the beginning of these episodes. He has a new obsession with planets. He's always loved the moon and planets, but it's really ramped up, and it's just the number one thing in his life right now. He sings about them, he identifies them in books. We have a planet matching game that he's just really digging. He's focused on planets. Planets are life. He's starting swim lessons next month, so I'm really stoked about that. He's getting really good at his balance bike, and that's cool to see. It's basically, imagine a bike. If you don't know what a balance bike is, it's a bike without pedals. So you just like kind of coast along, you take steps on your bike, but then you get a little brave. He gets a little brave and kind of coasts for a minute. And it's supposed to help build balance so that then you can move on to a traditional pedal bike and have already established that sense of balance. I am really excited for the spring because the cabin fever has reached its peak and Mother Nature better get it together and give us some warmth soon because we are about to have a winter time conniption, or at least I am. I'm ready. I'm ready for spring. I'm ready for sun. Get it together, Mother Nature. We did go to the park today. It was like 44 degrees. The real feel, quote, real feel, wasn't quite that, but it was 44-ish. And we went to the park. And I was like, you know what? It's warm enough. Tired of being inside. Let's run it. Okay, Felix update is over. And I promise my rambling is almost over. And we're going to get into this episode today, but I feel like this next little nugget of rambling I'm about to do, it really pertains to the subject matter of today's episode. It's really important to preface, however, it's really important to say this before we get into the episode. And I don't want to open up a can of worms regarding what is going on in the US right now, because this isn't a political podcast. I've said this on other podcasts, and if you don't know, and you probably don't if you live in the United States, you might be listening to this and be like, oh, of course I know, but a lot of people don't know. The rest of the world outside of the United States seems to be protesting for us. Europe, Asia, parts of Africa are all having massive protests against the US government. And yeah, we're having protests here too, but it is wild to see other countries protesting for us. I have never seen this in my lifetime. This week, there were protests in Texas, North Carolina, New York, and a bunch of other places. I don't know, for probably most of the states. A lot of news outlets aren't covering this because the government in the United States controls most of our news outlets. But look into it. People are actively protesting everywhere. And I saw that an ice truck took people into custody a few miles from my house just the other day. So if you're wondering, I'll just say it. I'm just going to throw it out there. I'm just saying it. If you're like, where's this guy? Where's this guy sit? What's he doing? Where's he at? Elon Musk did a Nazi salute on live television. Donald Trump is a fascist. Our rights as citizens are at an extreme risk, and the oligarchy of crook billionaires is trying to control and sabotage our outlets of communication. And honestly, I think America is at a tipping point. I think some kind of mass revolution or movement is about to happen pretty soon. And you can call it a psyops, you can call it a narrative controlled by X, Y, or Z. You can call it whatever you want. Whatever the reason for all of this is, I don't know. There's only a fraction of people in the United States that do know. But what I do know is that we are going to see some sort of big change happening very soon. So be safe, strap in. We're going to get through this. The important thing to remember is that things like this have been happening since the dawn of humankind. And it doesn't make what's happening now any easier or palatable or justified in any way, but we will get through this. It's a dip in the wave. It's a dark time, but the light will come again. We have to not think of this as the end of the world, as the end of our freedoms. This is just a hiccup, and this will pass. And think about how you can fight against this oppression. We all have skills that can help. You can raise awareness. You don't have to be one of the people on the front lines with a Molotov cocktail, although those people are needed too. We're in a wild time. Anyway, I said I wasn't going to open up this can of worms, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on and to remind everyone, number one, be mad if you need to be. Be sad. Be what you need to be. But also remember compassion and also be safe, but act in ways that you can. Provide what you can to this movement that is happening. Apply yourself in ways that you think are going to have an intentional and real impact. Okay, so one last thing before we actually get going. Whatever platform you're listening on, there was a way to like, comment, subscribe, or leave a rating or review. All of that goes a very, very, very long way. So if you could do that, it would be greatly appreciated. Also, I have a Patreon. The link to that will be in the show's notes if you feel like going an extra step to support. You get early access to podcasts, music, art, all of that jazz. And once again, that link is in the show's notes. Today, I am existing and moving forward just purely on caffeine. I am sleep deprived. I was wondering whether or not I was going to record this episode today. So if I seem any type of way on this episode, or if I seem like I'm rambling, or if I seem like I am saying a factoid and then I slip up and like maybe mispronounce something or whatever, give me some grace. I am very tired today. I'm so tired, and I'm being held together by caffeine and hope. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Why did I pick today's topic? I think that kind of goes without saying. It seems relevant, and that's all I'm going to say on that. The first thing I want to talk about today, the first thing I want to bring up is a lesser known nugget of history. So imagine discovering that the US government secretly recruited Nazi scientists after World War II. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is reality. And it's the reality of Operation Paperclip, one of many truths that history tried to bury. From 1945 to 1959, Operation Paperclip was a secret U.S. intelligence program after World War II that brought over 1,600 German scientists, many of them with their families, but it brought over scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of whom were former Nazis, to the United States to work for the American government, primarily to gain access to advanced technology like rocketry in the face of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. This included notable figures like Werner von Braun, who later became a key figure in NASA's space program. And this whole Operation Paperclip, it has been valued at $10 billion in patents and industrial processes. The goal of this whole thing was to acquire advanced German scientific knowledge, particularly in areas, like I said, in rocketry, and then also to gain a technological advantage over countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union themselves. These scientists and engineers and such, many of them were guilty of loads of war crimes. You got to remember here, Germany was straight up experimenting on people in the most heinous ways. Eugenics, embryo manipulation. They were literally trying to fuse people with animals. Really like gnarly sci-fi stuff. And the US just opened the doors for these scientists and technicians, and some of their efforts once they got here were directed towards synthetic fuels, medicine, and other fields of research. Notable advancements in aeronautics fostered rocket and spaceflight technologies pivotal in the space race. You got to remember, this was a time when everyone was trying to get to the moon. And it was on the global stage, if you got to the moon first, you were looking like the top dog. You were looking like, and I have my own thoughts on the first. Okay, let me just clear, let me be real straightforward about this. Do I think we've been to the moon? Yes, I do. I think we've been there, for sure. Do I think the first lunar landing was real? I don't know. I kind of lean toward no because of the global stage and like I just said, who's going to be the top dog once we get there. I kind of lean toward the first one it looks sus, it sounds sus, but I don't know. It could have been real. There are people much smarter than me that say it's real. There are people much smarter than me that say it's fake. So who's to say? I kind of feel like the footage doesn't look real. The evidence is kind of sus. I don't know. But anyway, this space race is happening. Operation Paperclip played a crucial role in the establishment of NASA and the success of the Apollo missions to the moon, quote, end quote. Let me set up how this went down a little bit. So World War II ends and the Nazis are scrambling because they lost. There's all this infrastructure and technology and scientists and engineers. They're trying to destroy all of the technology and infrastructure, and all the scientists and engineers are trying to hide. The Nazis are retreating and they are taking their tech with them. And they had a lot of tech, a lot of weapons and designs and plans and vehicles and all this stuff. And they also had people that would be assets to any country that could get them before they were gone. So because of this, the US Army and the British Army made this thing called T-Force. And T-Force was their operational arm that's mission was to collect all of this tech and people. They were fetching weapons, jet and rocket-propelled aircraft, naval equipment, field radios, secret chemicals, aero medicine research, gliders, and scientific and industrial personalities, aka the scientists and engineers we've been talking about. Wernher von Braun and more than 1,000 of his colleagues decided to surrender to Americans in 1945. One of the engineers later recalled their options, and in this this quote, it's not funny, but it's also kind of funny. So one of the engineers, once they're getting captured in 1945, he says, "We despise the French. We are mortally afraid of the Soviets, and we do not believe the British can afford us. So that leaves the Americans." Like, it's not funny, but it's like, okay, so of our options, I guess we got to go with America. So this sucks, but here we are. And all of this collecting of all these people, all of these scientists and engineers, it didn't all happen at once. Like I said, it happened between 1945 and 1959. And in that time, they were all plopped down into different bases and military locations in the United States, and many of them came with their families. After more than 2 decades of service and leadership in NASA, 4 Nazi members from Operation Paperclip were awarded the NASA Distinguished Service Medal in 1969. Actually, it was that 3 of them were awarded the medal in 1969 and then another one in 1973. Whatever assets couldn't be taken by the T-Force were destroyed. And they didn't want anyone getting their hands on tech that could be used against them. And there isn't a lot of info out there about this, but it stands to reason that I'm sure that the people leading T-Force killed scientists and anyone who wouldn't cooperate for that same reason. They didn't want them working with the Soviet Union or any other country like them or any country that allied with them. In Huntsville, Alabama, where my grandma was from, in 1960, NASA set up the Marshall Space Flight Center after taking control of the Development Operations Division from the Army's Redstone Arsenal. And Wernher von Braun became the first director of this facility, of the Marshall Space Flight Center. And the Marshall Space Flight Center's development team was formed by American engineers from the Redstone Arsenal and 118 German migrants who came through Operation Paperclip. So over 100 of these Operation Paperclip engineers were stationed in Huntsville, Alabama. German Marshall engineers created the launch vehicles and designed some launching facilities at Cape Canaveral in Florida during the Apollo program. They also created the Saturn rocket line, which was the kind of rocket that sent American astronauts to the moon. So these former Nazis weren't just helping to develop things behind the scenes. They were pretty much like high-level dudes working for our government and for NASA. For 50 years, from 1963 to 2003, the Strughold Award, which was named after Hubertus Strughold, the father of space medicine, for his central role in developing innovations like the spacesuit and space life support systems, was the most prestigious award from the Space Medicine Association. On October 1st, 2013, in the aftermath of a Wall Street Journal article published on December 1st, 2012, which highlighted his connection to human experiments during World War II, the Space Medicine Association's executive committee announced that the Space Medicine Association Strughold Award had been retired. So let me break that down just a little bit for you. As recent as 2013, there were awards going out from a NASA organization to Nazis in 2013. And then the Wall Street Journal reports on this and they say, yo, check out what's happening. NASA is giving awards to Nazi scientists. And then shortly after that, this Space Medicine Association and the Stronghold Award is retired. That's how recently we are dealing with this stuff. And it's modern stuff. It's still going on, and it has had ripples throughout the US military and its branches. In a 2014 book, Annie Jacobson investigated 21 prominent scientists and technicians recruited by Paperclip and found that 15 were active Nazi Party members. 10 served in preliminary groups like the SS or the SA, and 8 worked directly with major Nazi leaders, and 6 were tried at Nuremberg. So, yeah, like 11 years ago, this author Annie Jacobson was investigating scientists and technicians that were Nazis, straight up Nazis, working with the Nazi Party. So our government it's been sus for a long time. It's not just sus now. And it hasn't, I don't know what to say here. This is just crazy. Anyway, let's move on to our next truth that was buried, that they tried to hide. And I say they, I mean they. You know who I mean by they. Like the capital THEY. The Anunnaki Time Lords, the reptilian humanoid overlords, the, the people, the wizard behind the curtain that's pulling the strings, and yeah, that's they. You know who they are. This next one is probably something you've heard of. And if you haven't read or heard about it directly, you've definitely seen it referenced or parodied in some way, in some movie or some book. We're going to talk a little bit about MK Ultra. So MK Ultra, in a nutshell, MK Ultra was a series of experiments carried out by the CIA. They experimented on people with different drugs. They wanted to see if they could break people down for interrogations or to get sensitive information, or for a few other reasons, but for all intents and purposes, basically they were trying to break people's minds with drugs. MK Ultra kicked off in 1953 and ran until 1973. And honestly, it kind of sounds like something out of a sci-fi thriller movie. And like this is, like I said, it's been referenced in sci-fi thriller movies because it's so weird and insane. The CIA was secretly messing with people's minds using all kinds of unethical methods. They'd secretly dose people with massive amounts of LSD and other psychoactive drugs without them knowing. But it didn't stop there. They also experimented with electroshock therapy, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and isolation. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, there were cases of verbal and sexual abuse, along with other forms of outright torture. It's one of the most shocking government programs ever revealed. Before Project MK Ultra, there was something called Project Artichoke. And Project Artichoke was a CIA program that sounds honestly just as shady. MK Ultra itself was run by the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence and even worked with the US Army's biological warfare labs. They crossed all kinds of ethical and legal lines, using unsuspecting US and Canadian citizens as test subjects without their consent. The program was massive, and it was disguised as, quote, research at over 80 places, including colleges, hospitals, prisons, and even pharmaceutical companies. While some higher-ups knew about the CIA's involvement, the agency mostly hid behind fake fronts or organizations. The whole thing came to light in 1975 thanks to investigations by the Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church. But digging into MK Ultra wasn't easy for them. The CIA director, who was named Richard Helms, had already ordered most of the files to be destroyed in 1973. So they see these investigations on their back, and they're like, burn it, burn all the paperwork, burn all the evidence. And investigators had to rely on testimonies and the few documents that they did have that did survive. And then in 1977, the Freedom of Information Act happened, and it turned up 200,000 or more documents, which the CIA had been keeping in their seedy windowless warehouse. And this sparked senator hearings. Some of MK Ultra's details were declassified as late as 2001, but there's no telling what might have been lost forever. So we get these declassified documents thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, and the CIA overturns things, but this is only probably the tip of the iceberg. We don't really know the extent of MK Ultra. And here's where things are going to get really weird, and they're going to tie in with our previous thing with Project Paperclip. And this is so wild, but you cannot make this stuff up. Back in the early 1940s, during World War II, Nazi scientists at concentration camps like Auschwitz conducted horrifying experiments on prisoners. They tested substances like barbiturates, morphine derivatives, and hallucinogens such as mescaline on Polish, Russian, Jewish, and other prisoners of war. And the goal was to create a truth serum that could completely break a person's will. Historian Stephen Kinzer even argued that the CIA's MK Ultra program picked up where these Nazi experiments left off, using some of the same drugs like mescaline on unsuspecting test subjects. So is there a parallel here? I'm going to go ahead and say yeah. Some of these Nazi scientists we recruited in the United States during Operation Paperclip were absolutely continuing their experiments with MK Ultra. U.S. interest in drug-based interrogation methods actually started earlier in 1943 when the Office of Strategic Services, which was the CIA's predecessor, tried to develop a, quote, truth serum, truth drug that could make people spill their secrets. And by 1947, the Navy was running Project Chatter, where they tested LSD on human subjects for the first time. Then, in 1950, the CIA ramped things up under General Walter Bedell Smith with a series of interrogation projects, starting with something called Project Bluebird, which would later be renamed as Project Artichoke, which was the predecessor to MK Ultra. But Project Artichoke wasn't just about interrogation, it was about seeing if someone could be brainwashed into committing an assassination without realizing it. Have you ever seen Zoolander? I don't know if you if you're listening to this and you've seen Zoolander, it's kind of like that. This is kind of what they were doing, and this is where it comes back to this sort of brainwashing and secret. What's the word? Not trigger agent, but sleeper agent, I think is what I'm looking for. This is where the whole idea of a sleeper agent comes from, where you get conditioned by brainwashing or by drugs, and then you get turned on and you become an agent for the government to assassinate or do whatever they want you to do. But all of this is it's chilling stuff, and it's straight out of a dystopian nightmare. They spent an estimated 10 million or more on MK Ultra, which adjusted for today's standard, adjusted for inflation for today, that would be $87.5 million on this project. Documents obtained from the CIA in 1976 showed that in 1953, the CIA considered purchasing 10 kilograms of LSD, which is enough for 100 million doses. The proposed purchase aimed to stop other countries from controlling the supply. Once Project MK Ultra started in 1953, experiments including administering LSD to mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and prostitutes, quote, people who could not fight back, began. And then came this thing called, and this is all under the umbrella of MK Ultra. I feel like he's talking about a lot of things. This is all related to MK Ultra. So within the realm of MK Ultra, there was this thing called Operation Midnight Climax, and which sounds like something out of a silly spy movie or something, but it was very real and very unethical. The CIA set up fake brothels in San Francisco, luring in unsuspecting men who they figured would be too embarrassed to ever report on what happened to them. And once they were there, once these men went to the brothels, they were secretly dosed with LSD, and the rooms were rigged with one-way mirrors so that CIA agents could watch and film everything for research purposes. And the CIA's research, like I said earlier, went beyond just unsuspecting randos. They tested on CIA employees, military personnel, and even agents they suspected to be double agents during the Cold War. And there's stories about them researching drugs on people in Vietnam and gassing them with weird psychedelic chemicals and stuff. The fallout was severe. Some people suffered long-term mental damage, and a few even died as a result. And if that wasn't bad enough, the CIA also bribed heroin addicts into taking LSD by offering them more heroin. It's a horrifying chapter in the history of the United States, but it is something that happened. It is something that has been declassified. You can find countless articles on this online. It was so easy to do research for this because there's just such a wealth of information. After the Freedom of Information Act happened, the floodgates opened and people got to see what was happening with this. It's very disgusting and weird and frightening. Let's move on to our next thing that they tried to hide. This next thing, so for a while it wasn't hidden. It did get some press. It did get some coverage, but shortly after it happened, and the generations, the generation it happened to and the generations after, it kind of got buried. It got put aside and it got, let's just get into it. The next thing I want to talk about is the Tulsa Race Massacre. It's also called the Tulsa Race Riot or the Black Wall Street Massacre. For over 2 days, from May 31st to June 1st, 1921, white mobs, including some deputized and armed local officials, attacked black residents and destroyed the thriving Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And at the time, Greenwood was one of the wealthiest black communities in the United States and was even named the Black Wall Street. But in just 48 hours, more than 35 square blocks of homes and businesses were burned to the ground. It was an outright act of white supremacy and terrorism and remains one of the worst incidents in racial violence in American history. And a lot of people don't even know about this. The aftermath of the Tulsa Race Massacre was devastating. Over 800 people ended up in the hospital, and around 6,000 black residents were forcibly detained in large facilities, some for many days. Official reports from the Oklahoma Bureau of Vital Statistics listed 36 deaths, but a 2001 investigation by the Tulsa Reparations Coalition dug deeper. They found evidence of 39 deaths, 26 black and 13 white, based on autopsy reports, death certificates, and other records. And still, estimates from that same investigation suggest the real death toll could have been anywhere from 75 to 300 people. So to this day, we really don't know how many people died during this because it was very buried and very not covered and very, very much not spoken about. The event that sparked the Tulsa Race Massacre is widely believed to have started when a group of black men were leaving the area, and an elderly white man confronted someone named O.B. Mann, a black man, and the white man, he demanded that O.B. Mann turn over his pistol. Mann refused, and when the white man tried to disarm him, a gun went off. According to the sheriff, that's when, quote, all hell broke loose. Both sides opened fire, and the shooting lasted until midnight. Outnumbered, the group of black men retreated to Greenwood, and by the end of the gunfight, 12 people were dead, 10 white and 2 black. Another account claims that shooting started when black business owners tried to defend a lone black man who was being attacked by a group of white men near the courthouse. And it's possible that this was just another part of the chaos that was already unfolding. This was 1921 in Oklahoma. I don't feel like I have to say any more than that for you to know that there was strong racial tension. And as word of the violence spread, things escalated quickly. White mobs invaded Greenwood that night and into the morning, killing black residents, burning homes, and looting businesses. And by noon on June 1st, the Oklahoma National Guard had imposed martial law, bringing an end to the massacre. And another little point I want to make here is that this place was thriving. Greenwood was thriving, and businesses were doing well. Black communities were set up. They were building. They were making their own self-sustained communities that were separate from white communities. And they said, you know what? If you're going to segregate us, we're going to do our best to do our best. And they did. They were doing very well. And the white communities surrounding them that weren't doing as well as them didn't like that. And that is the real catalyst for this situation. Let me give you a timeline on how this went down. And I'm going to keep this brief. I'm just going to touch on some notes here on how this stuff happened. June 1st, 1921. Throughout the early morning hours, groups of armed white and black men squared off in gunfights. Around 1 a.m., the white mob began setting fires, mainly in businesses or commercial spaces at the southern edge of the Greenwood district. Around 5 a.m., just as the sun was rising, a train whistle or a siren, depending on the account, sounded. Some rioters took this as a signal to unleash a full-scale assault on Greenwood. A white man stepped out from behind the Frisco depot and was shot by a sniper. That seemed to set everything off. Crowds of rioters flooded the neighborhood, coming on foot and by car. The first group of 5 white men charged in by car but didn't make it far. Residents opened fire, killing all 5 within a block. But the sheer number of attackers was too much to handle, and black residents were forced to retreat north along Greenwood Avenue toward the edge of town. Panic broke out, and families fled for their lives. Rioters shot indiscriminately, killing many along the way. Splitting into smaller groups, they looted homes and businesses, smashing into occupied houses and forcing people out into the streets. Some survivors later testified that rioters drove or marched them to detention centers. Meanwhile, rumors swirled among the attackers that the new Mount Zion Baptist Church was being used as a fortress and an armory. Supposedly, and I don't know why I like this, but supposedly 20 caskets full of rifles had been delivered there. There's something about that. In the midst of all of this chaos, they're setting up a base of arms in this Mount Zion Baptist Church, and then they're getting caskets full of rifles, 20 caskets full of rifles to fight back against the white supremacists that are trying to overtake their neighborhood. I just think that is, I don't know why, it's unfortunate and it sucks, but it's poetic in this crazy way. I honestly don't know how a movie hasn't been made about this. I feel like it should be. Maybe there is. I don't know. I haven't looked to see if maybe there is a movie about this. I need to check this out. But anyway, getting back to the timeline of things, numerous eyewitnesses described airplanes carrying white assailants who fired rifles and dropped firebombs on buildings, homes, and fleeing families. Law enforcement officials later said that the planes were to provide reconnaissance and protect against the uprising of Greenwood, which no one should believe at all because they're pigs. Law enforcement personnel were thought to be aboard at least some flights, if not all of them. The Oklahoma National Guard arrived by special train about 9:15 a.m. with 109 troops from Oklahoma City, ordered in by the governor, who could not legally act until he had contacted all the appropriate local authorities, including the mayor, the sheriff, and police chief. And meanwhile, while all this was going on, the troops paused to have breakfast, because they couldn't act until they had all the approval of all these people. And I think, honestly, what happened was that the tides were turning for the white supremacists that were invading Greenwood, and then they were waiting. They were literally eating breakfast, the National Guard. And then, like, once things weren't looking good for the white supremacists, that's when they flipped the switch and they're like, okay, bring in the National Guard so we can, quote, like, handle this situation because it's getting out of control now, as if it hadn't already been out of control for hours and hours. But by 9:43, martial law was declared. No one was ever convicted for the violence that took place during the massacre. For decades, the horror and loss went largely ignored. The event was barely mentioned in local, state, or even national histories. In fact, the Tulsa race riot of 1921 was so erased from public consciousness that both black and white people grew up without knowing what had actually happened. It wasn't even acknowledged in things like the Tulsa Tribune in their edition of 15 years ago today or 25 years ago today. In 2017, a report on the history of the Tulsa Fire Department didn't even mention the massacre, showing just how deeply the event was buried. There are some reasons for why the event was buried. None of them, I'm not justifying any of these. These are just reasons why. One of them is that there was a fear that the past might repeat itself. Black residents didn't want to pass on the pain of the massacre to their children, or white residents didn't want to admit their involvement. They didn't want to admit that their relatives or friends or family had participated in the massacre. And then there's also the fact that the city wanted to maintain its reputation. Tulsa was trying to maintain its place as the oil capital of the world, and they wanted to look good. So having a racist massacre on their track record didn't look good for them. So it was buried. It was suppressed. It was something that a lot of people knew about, but then suppressed and didn't know about. Future generations didn't really know about until recently. This next thing is going to be our last thing. It's going to be the last truth that they tried to hide. I'm going to be talking about the Japanese American internment during World War II. It is a deeply painful and complicated chapter in U.S. history, where over 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly relocated and imprisoned in internment camps across the western U.S. from 1942 to 1945. After Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, December 4th, 1941, the U.S. government feared that Japanese Americans might be sympathetic to Japan or even be spies or saboteurs. This fear was fueled obviously by racial prejudice and wartime hysteria rather than any evidence of disloyalty. And although there was no substantial evidence of espionage or sabotage among Japanese Americans, the government moved forward with plans to remove them from the West Coast, where they lived, where the majority of them lived. And the decision was largely driven by, number one, racism, and number two, economic factors, as many Japanese Americans had built successful businesses and farms, particularly in California. There was this executive order, 9066. If you're a fan of Star Wars, you'll know Execute Order 66. This was like that. Executive Order 9066. Executive Order 9066. Not to make light of their situation, but it just draws a parallel with this evil empire in Star Wars who's acting on just pure darkness and evil. That's what this was. It was acting on pure racism and ignorance. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the military to designate areas as exclusion zones, effectively removing Japanese Americans from their homes and businesses. I feel like we are unfortunately about to see this with Hispanic People across America, across the board, anyone from south of our border is about to see a very similar thing to Executive Order 9066. Anyway, the order did not single out Japanese people by name, but allowed the military to forcibly relocate anyone of Japanese descent, regardless of citizenship, from these zones. Over 100,000 people, 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens, were relocated to 10 internment camps in remote areas of the western U.S. And life in these camps was really bad. It was a bad time. The internment camps were hastily constructed in these barren areas, far from cities or family members. The living conditions were poor, with inadequate housing, poor sanitation, and harsh weather conditions. Many internees were forced to leave their homes and businesses behind, losing everything they had worked for. Some were even stripped of their savings and valuables. Despite the hardship, Japanese Americans in the camps often formed tight-knit communities and tried to make the best of the situation. They were given meager rations and made to perform labor for the military, such as digging ditches and working in factories. And not everybody was just on board with this. You know, the government came to doors of Asian Americans and they were like, you got to go to the camps. And there was a resistance to internment. Despite their wrongful imprisonment, many Japanese Americans sought to demonstrate their loyalty to the U.S. One of the notable instances of this was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a U.S. Army unit made up of mostly Japanese Americans, many of whom had family members still in camps, and the 442nd became the most decorated unit in the U.S. military, or in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. So this was a form of resistance in a way where it's like, we see you, government. You're thinking our people aren't loyal to you, or you're thinking our people are, because of their race, not going to align with what you want. And this 442nd unit was saying, look at us. Look over here. We have a horse in this race. We have family members that we want to come home to. And we have reasons to want to be in the United States. And we're going to fight for you. And we are going to be a presence in the U.S. military. So this was their form of resistance. This was their form of saying, you are wrong. You don't understand what you're doing. Let us show you. The internment was deeply traumatic for many, and there were various legal challenges. A case known as Korematsu versus the United States in 1944 reached the Supreme Court, which upheld the constitutionality of internment. The decision was controversial and years later widely discredited. In 1983, the case was reported and the conviction against Fred Korematsu was overturned. All of this about internment and the U.S. government doing shady stuff was, of course, it was suppressed, as the U.S. government does. They downplayed or completely ignored the severity of the internment, especially during and immediately after World War II. Media outlets were often complicit in presenting Japanese Americans as a political threat to national security, which fueled public support for their forced relocation. And the government portrayed internment as a necessary wartime measure, even as it became clear that there was no legitimate threat posed by Japanese Americans. After World War II ended, there was little public acknowledgement of the injustice of internment. The war effort had been framed as a fight for freedom and democracy abroad, but these principles were not extended to Japanese Americans. The story of the internment was left largely unspoken, and the people who had suffered in the camps faced discrimination and stigma for many years. And then there was this really messed up, there's just really what the F sort of situation called the model citizen narrative. Japanese Americans who were interned. I keep saying interned, but really it's imprisoned. But I'm gonna just keep moving with interned. Japanese Americans who were interned often faced pressure to conform to an idealized image of the model citizen. After the war, which discouraged them from speaking out about their experiences, many were afraid that discussing the camps would further tarnish their reputation and image, leading them to suppress their trauma. They had businesses, they had families they had to provide for. They came here to start a new life, and they came here to be Americans, and they wanted to be here. And they thought if they spoke out against the internment again and revealed their traumas, that this would further hinder their goals of being Americans and following their dreams that they came here to do. The government went to great lengths to prevent public scrutiny of the internment. Key documents related to the camps were classified or destroyed. Sound familiar? MKUltra? In fact, much of the record of the internment was concealed for decades. For instance, the War Relocation Authority, which was responsible for the internment camps, destroyed many documents related to the program in the 1940s and 1950s, making it harder for future generations to learn the full story. In 1980, a commission on wartime relocation and internment of civilians was established to investigate the internment. After years of research and testimony from surviving internees, the commission concluded in 1983 that the internment was a, quote, grave injustice, and recommended reparations for the survivors, which they eventually got. Obviously, this did not make up for what had happened to them, but in 1988, $20,000 was given to each surviving internee. And, this was an important step for the U.S. government to acknowledge and say, we're sorry, here's some money, but it came decades after the fact, and it was just a gross amount of money. They could have given them so much more. It wouldn't have, in the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't have made that much of a difference. You could have given them each $1 million, and it still would have not balanced the scales of injustice. But yeah, the internment had profound effects on Japanese American communities. Many families lost their homes, their businesses, and livelihoods, and the trauma endured by those who were interned has reverberated through the generations. The internment also complicated the identities of many Japanese Americans, some of whom were forced to reconcile their loyalty to the U.S. with the mistreatment that they suffered. And this whole story of Japanese American internment is part of this broader pattern of our government overreaching and their racism in U.S. history, along with other marginalized groups like African Americans, Native Americans, and others. The internment experience has become an important chapter in the ongoing struggle for civil rights and racial justice in America. The Japanese American internment is obviously most of us know about it now, but it was buried for a very long time and it didn't get a lot of recognition as like a thing that even happened for a very long time. It was minimized by mainstream narratives, and the lessons learned from this are still relevant today, particularly in the context of ongoing debates around immigration, national security, and racial discrimination. So yeah, that was our last truth that they tried to hide for the day. Let's get into a segment of the podcast I like to call Let's Ask AI. Let's Ask AI. Today, the question that I asked was, of the last decade, what do you think is the most unfortunate truth that has been suppressed? And AI answered, a significant documented case from the past decade involves the suppression of early internal research about social media's negative effect on mental health and societal polarization. Internal documents and whistleblowers' testimony revealed that major social media companies had data showing concerning impacts on teenage mental health, addiction like behavior patterns, and amplification of extreme content, while publicly downplaying these findings. This case is particularly notable because it affects hundreds of millions of users globally. The suppression was well documented through internal communications. The findings were later validated by independent academic research. It influenced key aspects of society, including youth development, public discourse, and democratic processes. So that is kind of a different lane from things we've been talking about today on the podcast, but preach, AI, preach. I have been not just I don't want to say like I've been onto this for years. So many people have been onto this for years. Social media is harmful. Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, name your poison. They're all highly addictive. They are all, and all of the companies behind them are downplaying the legitimate findings of them being addictive and harmful and gross and weird because it serves their profits. It's Meta and X and TikTok, all of them, every single one. They know that they get money the longer you stay on the platforms because they advertise to you. And then not only do they advertise to you, they sell the information. They know what you engage with, they know what you like, they know what you don't like, and they take that information, they package it up and they sell it to advertisers and they make a fortune off of that. The longer they can keep you on the thing, the more money they stand to make. So yeah, this is a terrible, terrible thing. It's a terrible truth that they try to hide. Thank you for being open and being real about that, AI. This episode has been dark. It just really has. And part of that is because that's just the nature of doing an episode like that, like this. Part of it is because, like I said, I'm just running on caffeine. We are getting through this. I'm sleep deprived and I'm feeling some kind of way. But whether or not I was sleep deprived or not, this episode was bound to be dark because we're talking about some really terrible things. So I wanted to swing in the other direction. I wanted to talk about some things to bring the vibe up a bit while we end this thing. So as we move into the fun facts, the last segment of the show, the fun facts, I don't really have a theme here other than I felt like these facts needed to be lighthearted and they needed to be fun and just sort of detached from the darkness. So let's get right into them. The first fun fact is about sloths. Sloths have a slow metabolism and only poop about once a week. Our next fun fact, and you might know this one, is about the unicorn. The unicorn is the national animal of Scotland. It's a symbol of purity, innocence, and masculinity and power. Our next fun fact is all about the chef's hat. According to culinary tradition, the pleats on a chef's hat, also called a toque, are said to represent the number of cooking techniques or recipes a chef has mastered, with the most common belief being that 100 pleats signify a chef knowing 100 ways to cook an egg. Our next fun fact is that astronauts can grow up to 3% taller while in space due to microgravity. This is because the weightless environment reduces compression on the discs in their spines. Our next and our last fun fact is that octopuses have 3 hearts, 2 peripheral hearts, and 1 central heart. These hearts work together to pump blood through the octopus's body, supplying oxygen to its muscles and organs. We made it, y'all. We made it to the end of this one. We won't let history repeat itself. We will move forward with love and light and empathy for our fellow humans. This unfolding oppression will stop, and we will see a bright dawn. It's going to get dark, y'all, but honestly, reality is a wave. It ebbs and flows and dips and rises. We need to stay informed, and we need to stay diligent in helping others understand how easily and quickly rights, equality, and freedom can be taken away. Keep your eyes and your heart open. I'll be back next week. Don't forget to leave those ratings, comments, likes, subscribes, all that stuff. There's a link to my Patreon in the show's notes. And lastly, don't forget to check on your mental health, and don't forget to check on the mental health of your loved ones. Bye.